All right, welcome everyone. Good morning, and thank you to all of the passionate advocates for justice and ocean sustainability in attendance today. My name is Max Valentine, and I'm the Illegal Fishing and Transparency Campaign Director for Oceana, the largest international advocacy organization dedicated solely to ocean conservation. Our panel today focuses on an urgent issue impacting our oceans, our dinner plates, and most importantly, people's lives around the world. Today, we are going to discuss two critical issues plaguing our seafood supply chain: illegal, unreported, and unregulated, or IUU fishing, and forced labor. IUU fishing is a rampant problem across the world's oceans because it's a low-risk, high-reward activity, especially on the high seas where a fragmented legal framework and a lack of effective enforcement allow it to thrive. As unsustainable fishing practices make fish scarcer and vessels need to travel further, operators may try to maintain their profit margins through reducing their labor costs via forced labor. Workers on fishing vessels face threats of violence far away from any authority to which they could report those violations. IUU fishing and the exploitation of laborers within the seafood industry are grave concerns that demand our immediate attention. We gather not only to acknowledge these issues, but also to chart a path forward. Up to 85% of the seafood consumed in the United States is imported. In 2022 alone, the US imported 3.4 billion kilograms of seafood worth more than $30 billion. As one of the world's largest seafood importing countries, the US has the responsibility and the purchasing power to ensure that the seafood products reaching consumers are not sourced from IUU fishing or forced labor. We have the power to reshape the global supply chain by calling for fair labor conditions, demanding accountability, and fostering change. We can ensure that all seafood is safe, legally caught, responsibly sourced, and honestly labeled. Today, our panelists will share their expertise of these issues, and you'll also have the opportunity to hear inspiring stories from fishers who have experienced truly horrible situations, and we'll explore tangible solutions to these problems. First, I would like to share an educational and inspiring message from Representative Jared Huffman from California. Representative Huffman is a champion of the oceans and is a leader on the issues of IUU fishing and forced labor. Representative Huffman will introduce us to the topics that we will hear about today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Congressman Jared Huffman, and I have the honor of representing California's beautiful North Coast, home to the scenic coastline of Northern California, stretching from the north of San Francisco all the way to the Oregon border. And I'm really glad to see all of you at this year's Capitol Hill Oceans Week. You folks have made it a point to highlight an important issue that I work on: illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And I'm honored that you've asked me to share a bit about my work to combat it. So first and foremost, thank you for bringing attention to this pervasive global problem. It is such a serious threat to the health and sustainability and resilience of our fisheries and marine ecosystems. And most folks don't even realize it's happening, or the fact that their seafood that they consume could be a product of IUU fishing. So aside from the damage that this, let's just call it pirate fishing because that's what it is, but aside from the damage it does to aquatic life and ecosystems, it is linked to egregious human rights violations, including forced labor and human trafficking. The conditions that victims are forced to live and work in are utterly inhumane. And these people can be trapped at sea for extremely long periods of time. Crew members can be subjected to myriad injustices, including physical, psychological, and sexual abuse, unsanitary and unsafe working conditions, 20-hour workdays, lack of pay, even murder. It's estimated that across the globe there are at least 128,000 people at sea in forced labor situations. So this is a huge problem for the seafood sector. And beyond the horizon on distant commercial fishing vessels, bad actors can engage in all manner of illegal and unethical practices without scrutiny. Poor oversight, weak regulations, and a lack of transparency make the commercial fishing sector an easy target for horrific abuses. And even though this is happening out of sight, far off our shores, This atrocity finds its way into our grocery store shelves and up to our doorsteps, onto our dinner plates. The United States is the largest seafood importer in the world. And because we don't have adequate oversight and regulations, we end up consuming and ultimately supporting pirate fishing products and practices, and that's not okay. That's why I've championed the Illegal Fishing and Forced Labor Prevention Act with my colleague, Congressman Garrett Graves from Louisiana. Much of this bill became law this past December, but there's still work to do. Our framework cracks down on pirate fishing by expanding NOAA's Seafood Import Monitoring Program, or SIMP, establishing seafood traceability and labeling requirements, and improving seafood inspections, and strengthening international fisheries management. We need to stop pirate fishing products from entering our markets and undercutting fishermen who follow the rules. And we need to combat the humanitarian crisis that's going on out there by ensuring that the United States only participates in an ethical seafood supply chain. It's simple. Seafood should not come at the cost of human rights. So thank you for all of your passion and advocacy. I look forward to continuing our work together. Have a great rest of your week and enjoy Capitol Hill Oceans Week.
Thank you, Representative Huffman. Please allow me to introduce you all to our panelists today. First, we have Noor Hamadi, who is an advocacy counsel at the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable, or ICAR. ICAR is a coalition of more than 40 members and partner organizations committed to ending corporate abuse of people and the planet. And then we have John Hocevar, the Oceans Campaign Director for Greenpeace USA, who oversees the organization's work on distant water fisheries, protected areas, plastic pollution, and deep sea mining. John, I'll leave it to you.
Thanks, Max. As is often the case between my fellow panelists and some of the people I recognize from the audience, I realize I'm talking to people who have more expertise than I do on some of these issues. Fortunately, today I'm here to bring you the voices of migrant fishers so you can hear directly from them about the conditions they have to deal with at sea. We'll be showing you clips from Before You Eat, a documentary produced by the SBMI, the Indonesian Migrant Workers Association, and supported by Greenpeace. The film was produced in Indonesia with migrant fishers who had returned. Some of you might wonder why environmental groups are talking about human rights and labor issues. Greenpeace has always been a seagoing organization for more than 50 years now. And we often witness boats that look like they are barely staying afloat, very clearly lacking decent working or living conditions for crew. Sometimes we saw crew members that looked malnourished or just desperate. Over the years, we stopped questioning whether we had enough expertise to address human rights issues or if it was our job to speak up. We realized that human rights and environmental abuses are inextricably linked. As many of you know, we've eaten most of the large fish across all the world's oceans. That's made it more difficult for fishing companies to turn a profit. They have to spend more time and more money to catch the same amount of fish. To cut costs, some of these companies have aimed at their workforce. Fishers often lack decent food or working conditions and are not paid a living wage. They can be forced to work many hours and long days. This is obviously bad for workers. It's also bad for our oceans, as it enables companies to operate more boats, which puts more pressure on marine populations. So it's not even really a cycle, it's a spiral where the problem just keeps getting worse, both for workers and for the oceans. So if we only look at the environmental side of illegal fishing, we leave out the people who have the greatest stake in fixing the problem. We also miss the opportunity to apply human rights and labor laws to the fight against illegal fishing, because many of the vessels with the worst environmental records are also involved in forced labor and human trafficking. In this clip, you'll hear about tuna fishers being pressured to catch sharks. Some of the money from shark finning, can go to crew members as bonuses. Tuna companies say they oppose shark finning, but it continues to be common practice on tuna vessels because workers are not paid a living wage. Shark finning is part of the business model behind cheap canned tuna sold in grocery stores across the United States. You also see Indonesian fishers talking about several of the international labor organizations' 11 indicators of forced labor. Things like excessive overtime, abusive working and living conditions, intimidation, and threats. Think about the places you've worked and the kinds of things you've had to put up with on the job. Now picture yourself in a working environment where violence is so widespread that many of the workers we interview have personally witnessed beatings or even murders. Okay, let's play the clip.
Paling jam-jam 3 begitu bikin karton buat malam, yang pencarian dapat banyak, isi ini lagi ikan di karton.
Jadi pokoknya waktunya kerja ya harus kerja, nggak peduli itu orang sakit, nggak peduli ibaratnya itu sehat, nggak mengenal itu hujan minggir apa istirahat, enggak, belum selesai ya terus.
Jangankan waktu untuk beribadah, waktu untuk tidur aja susah. Nggak ada tempat. Pernah kerja 2 hari 2 malam nggak ada waktu tidur. Tapi keseringannya sih kerja 4 jam, itu paling banyak waktu tidur. Pindah ke kapal kemarin itu pas lagi perjalanan sandar. Terus kaptennya bingung mau sandarin kami kemana gitu. Terus si kapten kami ini ngomongnya, kalian nggak tahu mau dipindahin kemana, apa kalian lompat ke laut gitu, sempat dia bilang gitu. Sampai di Cina kami langsung dioper ke kapal lain.
Kapal pada parkir,
Pelayaran penderitaan.
pelayaran ngenes.
Yang kami tahu kami mau disandarin. Rupanya begitu nyampe ke kapal itu malah kerja. Dibilang sama kapten, saya nggak tahu kalian di sini cuma dititipin. Saya nggak tahu dengan bos kalian. Saya juga nggak punya nomor bos kalian. Dia bilang gitu.
Tapi mereka berbeda kapal sama kami. Kami kapal cumi satu kapal. Pas di kapal troll Cina lokal itu beda, orangnya pisah lagi.
Kapalnya kapal
Jaring
kapal
teri.
troll, sejenis kapal troll.
Pengemis kita di sana.
Iya,
Kerja tapi kayak pengemis.
logikanya gini yang bikin bingung kita kerja nyari duit ya, masa rokok aja bilang yang nggak ada, tinggal potong duit keras kan enak kan.
Saya minta rokok sebatang itu WC.
Meo.
Sabun mandi, kita tidak memakai sabun selama 6 bulan, baru 6 bulan baru dikasih sabun sama peralatan buat mandi gitu.
Ya namanya kerja kan di kapal sama kayak orang Cina, orang Filipina, Myanmar, Indo kan kebutuhan di kapal itu sama. Seharusnya apa yang dibutuhkan orang Cina itu dibutuhkan kita juga. Harusnya kita dapat kebutuhan yang sama, bahan-bahan yang sama.
Setahu saya kalau di kapal itu yang emang bayar itu rokok. Kalau ini dihitung semua kayak mie, kita dihitung. Sabun juga dihitung.
Kita dikasih bonus, kita bongkar 1 ton mancing bongkar itu 1 ton, saya dihargai 1 yuan.
1 tonnya 1 yuan itu setara Rp2.000.
Itu harga tenaga kita di orang Cina itu murah sekali, 1 ton 2.000 perak.
Kan kena jaring, apa aja kan kejaring. Kadang dapat pari, hiu, diambil siripnya dulu baru dibuang ikan hiunya.
Kayak kita ABK ya disuruh kok, ya mau apa, dibilang enggak ya orang kita di situ kerja.
Nggak ada pilihan lagi, mereka harus mau, kalau nggak mau mereka terancam. Dan kemudian dipaksa melakukan kejahatan yang tidak ada pilihan, mau nggak mau harus dilakukan. Ada lagi modus operandinya dengan menggunakan istilah yang agak sedikit bagus, dengan ada bonus dari penangkapan ikan hiu. Disinilah terjadi ABK, salah satu orang yang tertuduh untuk melakukan illegal fishing, hiu fishing, menangkap hiu yang dilarang. Padahal yang menikmati hasil keuntungan adalah para pemilik kapal, para mandor.
Thank you. Imagine a world where the vastness of the oceans becomes your captor, cutting you off from the warmth of family and the comfort of familiar faces. For those trapped in forced labor on fishing boats, isolation and the absence of family contact are agonizing realities. Far from home, these individuals face a double burden. The physical demands of their labor are compounded by the profound loneliness that permeates this existence. In this desolate environment, the lack of family contact can deepen anguish. Birthdays pass unnoticed, celebrations go unshared, and the support that family provides in times of hardship can become a distant memory. Workers are left to bear the weight of their struggles alone, and the same is also true for their families who are left behind on shore, who wonder how their loved ones are doing or when the money will reach them. As if this weren't enough, add another layer of suffering, the anguish of food and water shortages. For those trapped in forced labor on fishing boats, these shortages are a daily reality. But it doesn't stop there. Rations, if provided at all, are meager, leaving workers weakened and often malnourished. These rations may go against religious dietary restrictions as well. Workers endure this physical strain of labor and hunger, and this can lead to serious situations in which workers' lives are put at risk.
Kita selama saya kerja, ibaratnya nggak ada kontak, nggak ada bisa telepon, nggak kasih kabar. Ya saya dan istri pasti juga saling memikirkan saya gimana itu istri di rumah, anak-anak saya. Istri mungkin sebaliknya ya pasti mikirkan itu saya di mana gimana keadaannya.
Nggak ada kabar, nggak ada kiriman, kan bingung. Ngurus 3 anak sendirian, ya kan? Kadang kan tetangga kata bilang, udah dapat kirim, aku mau masalah kiriman itu nggak terlalu dipikirin, yang penting itu udah ada kabar itu juga alhamdulillah senang. Ya emang sih semuanya pasti mikir kapan kirim gitu kan, butuh ya Mbak ya buat tiap hari, tapi nggak begitu ya alhamdulillah jualan walaupun cuma sedikit kan bisa mencukupi.
Jaring itu sebagian kami orang Indo memang udah nggak ada kerjaan, cuma nonton, tapi nggak bisa makan.
Nanti udah siap jaring, nanti ganti jaring baru, pokoknya nggak makan kita. Ketahuan makan nggak mau kapten. Dan kalau memang kita nggak peduli sama kapten, kita mau makan lapar demi nyawa kita pun nggak ada makanan, ditutup sama koki pintunya.
Makan apa bang? Iya. Segat tok. Ya Allah ngenes temen ya nih bayarannya. Mana kalau segak? Tuh. Prihatin ya. Duh, saking ngeli ya. Ngeli nemen.
Kalau makanan di kapal itu kita tergantung hasil tangkapan. Kalau tangkapan lagi kecil ya kita makan, kadang orang Cinanya yang masakin ya terserah dia, mau nggak ada rasanya, mau cuma bawang bombay doang. Pokoknya kita itu serba salah, nggak dimakan kita lapar, dimakan juga nggak enak.
Kami kerja di harusan Pak, tapi saya makan gini Pak, lihat Pak. Ini lauk apa Pak?
Kita mau bongkar palka aja itu makannya bubur putih lah, kayak orang sakit. Paling sama kacang goreng. Itu padahal kerjanya nggak sebentar. Palka kan itu kan besar kayak gudang, dingin lagi.
Kadang-kadang ya lauknya juga bubur sama bakpao.
Inilah kegiatan kami ngambilin sayur-sayur busuk di dalam gudang yang kemudian dimasak.
Makanan kami sehari-hari nih.
Yang katanya kerja kapal, sedangkan makan seperti anjing.
Iya, kerja berat makanan.
Nah ini sayur-sayur sudah membusuk, dimasak lagi buat kami. Dilempar keluar.
Tikus juga banyak di kapal.
Dikuliti, dimasak.
Kalau yang enak mungkin ke orang ABK Cina, perbedaan makanannya banyak sekali. Dan kami sering makannya memang tidak enak, apalagi maaf cakap ini saya muslim, jadi saya nggak makan babi. Seringnya mereka masak babi sama nasi putih, ya kita nggak makan nasi gitu. Tapi orang nih nggak ada pengertian, maksudnya ikan banyak dibuang-buang nggak apa-apa, tapi dimasak nggak mau orang nih. Kita pun minta masak, marah kokinya, nggak boleh. Minta duit, minta ganti bayaran. Cumi pun kita ambil satu pun ngamuk kapten. Lebih mahal harga cumi satu daripada gaji kamu di sini. Makanya seperti ini. Kebetulan kaptennya di dalam kamar tidur, kami panggang terus diam-diam, kami makan. Terus kami buang panggangan ini biar kapten pun nggak tahu. Kami ngambil ikan diam-diam. Air pun kami nggak punya, sampai air aqua ini kami colong dari atas gudang. Khusus buat minum. Minum satu botol aqua itu kami berlima tuh seteguk seorang. Asal nggak haus saja udah. Tiap hari kami ngambilnya satu botol aqua. Di saat pemanggangan ikan di atas knalpot. Nah ginilah kami panggang ikan buat makan.
Terus dari segi minuman juga kita kurang bagus, di sana banyak sulingan itu yang kuning-kuning itu.
As I'm sure is clear from Representative Huffman and John and Max's remarks, and from the clips you just watched, forced labor is endemic to IUU fishing. This is because in much of the seafood industry, there's a high dependence on migrant workers and distant water fishing for many of the reasons that John mentioned earlier. Distant water fishing fleets can be out at sea for extended periods of time, sometimes trapping workers out at sea for years without adequate forms of communication, without the ability to leave, and where it's difficult to track them and know what's happening on board those vessels. The fishing industry's dependence on migrant workers and distant water fishing create an environment where labor abuses and exploitation can flourish. The Department of Labor's list of goods produced using forced and child labor includes a long list of different types of seafood species. The list also includes 20 countries, including China, Taiwan, and many others. While we don't know how much seafood in US markets was caught or processed using IUU fishing, using forced labor, Representative Huffman already pointed out that the International Labor Organization found that 128,000 people are caught in forced labor at sea at any time. But actually, one thing the International Labor Organization notes is that because it's so hard to tell where or when forced labor is taking place out at sea, the number is likely much higher than this and is hard to track. But even with stronger rules and regulations around forced labor in the United States, seafood caught in the US may still be processed using forced labor elsewhere. Seafood caught in US waters is sometimes imported to other countries, primarily China, where the fish is processed and where there's a high risk that workers in processing facilities are enduring conditions of forced labor. Then the fish is re-imported back into the US. About 20% of seafood imports into the US are imported in this way. The next clip you'll see will highlight a couple of important issues. The first is access to Wi-Fi. Many fishers on these distant water vessels don't have access to Wi-Fi. Not only does this isolate them from the rest of the world and prevent them from being able to contact their families, it also prevents them from issuing grievances or reaching out for support regarding the poor conditions on the vessel they're on. And even when vessels do have Wi-Fi, they often limit workers' access to it. An NGO called the Global Labor Justice International Labor Rights Forum, along with Indonesian and Taiwanese rights groups, launched a campaign aimed at highlighting the need for stronger protections for Wi-Fi and communication equipment access for workers aboard distant water fishing vessels. The second issue you'll see highlighted in the next clip is the degree to which workers on fishing vessels face severe malnourishment. Workers often are given very little to eat, as you just saw, and in addition to long working hours, sometimes up to 48 hours nonstop, without sleep, results in them frequently being malnourished. And when they do get sick, workers don't receive proper care and are expected to continue working. And malnourishment on vessels frequently results in death. There are cases of employers having a complete lack of regard for human life and often throwing workers overboard when they're too sick or after they pass away and refusing to send their bodies back to their families to receive a proper burial. So these conditions are really grim, and I'll let you start the clip now.
Namanya bahasa Cina, kita kurang paham. Kita tanya pun dirahasiakan. Nomornya ganti-ganti dia. Setiap melangkah ke negara orang, kita ganti nomor. Ini pas kami dikejar sama militer Korea karena operasi di Laut Korea tanpa izin. Kita keberadaan di Laut Korea Utara yang ngejar Korea Selatan. Kami lari kumpulnya ke Laut Jepang. Sementara kami disembunyikan tiap hari. Kalau udah melewati negara batas Korea udah sembunyi, disuruh sembunyi.
Malahan setiap dapat jaringan HP kami disita biar kami nggak hubungin ke Indonesia gitu ataupun ke darat.
Kami sih berharap sempat didempet kapal Korea biar kami bisa lompat, biar kami bisa ditolong, maksudnya biar kami nggak kerja di sini lagi. Karena kerjanya memang nggak sesuai dengan perjanjian dan kontrak. Kalau kami udah nebak dari pertama, memang ini kayak perdagangan manusia nih, penggelapan ABK.
Yang pertama saya sakit tuh di kapal tuh 369. Iya, yang sakit kemarin juga sama mereka juga. Dia mulai dari kaki, bengkak, maksudnya kayak kram-kram begitu kakinya. Sudah seminggu adalah dia kram, yang tambah betis saya makin hari makin naik, itu saya juga kaget lagi. Pas langkah juga merasa berat. Pas itu kapten dia lihat kaki saya, pas dia pencet kaki saya, dagingnya nggak naik, dagingnya malah masuk ke dalam ulang. Lama dia keluar, dia kasih 3 obat itu. Tapi saya tahu yang satu tuh obat vitamin yang itu yang bulat. Dia bilang sama saya, bilang nanti kita dempet sama kapal 366, nanti kamu pindah ke 366 situ karena 366 ada orang sakit juga. Kasih obat ini terus. Maksudnya sakitnya juga sama sakit saya juga yang pas kemarin, sama juga sakitnya, bengkak dari kaki. Kalau dia pun sudah naik ke paha, ke dada.
Beralih ke informasi lain, saudara, anak buah kapal asal Indonesia ditemukan meninggal di kapal penangkap ikan berbendera Tiongkok. Petugas tim gabungan Angkatan Laut Lanal Batam dan Polda Kepulauan Riau mengamankan 2 kapal ikan berbendera Tiongkok di perairan Pulau Nipa, Batam, Kepulauan Riau.
Jangan hanya bicara satu APK meninggal, tapi lihat keluarganya di situ ada berapa ikut meninggal juga.
Mam, gimana mam? Mam, pindah ke mam. Korban ini kayak ombak nih, orang tanggung jawab ya, korban-korbannya. Sige, baru ngeliat takap deh, sini. Di patah tangan. Coba dong. Bukti. Kok bukti ya? Korban ombak kabe. Oh, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ya Allah. Oh, ini kecelakaan.
Now our panelists will talk about some of their recommendations. The United States' high demand for seafood combined with weak and poorly implemented regulations allows seafood sourced from IUU fishing and forced labor to flood the U.S. market, driving economic and ecological loss around the world. The lack of visibility and traceability allows illegally sourced or mislabeled products to enter the legal supply chain. Requiring transparency and traceability at every step provides the U.S. government with powerful tools towards combating these problems. One way we can combat these issues is expanding the limited definition of IUU fishing in the United States and elevate it to international standards. NOAA has the authority to address IUU fishing by keeping seafood associated with these illicit activities out of the U.S. market by taking action against countries that fail to address it in their fleets. Yet NOAA's use of a limited definition of IUU fishing weakens the agency's ability to take strong actions. Congress has already passed an expanded definition of IUU fishing multiple times and directed NOAA to revise their definition to more broadly apply to all IUU fishing regardless of where it occurs, and to include labor and human rights violations that would allow the U.S. to address the most egregious actions of vessels from other countries. In 2022, NOAA proposed a rule to expand the definition of IUU fishing and recognize the links with forced labor. An expanded definition is important to ensuring that the U.S. can take strong action against other countries engaged in IUU fishing and ignoring human rights abuses in their fleets. The proposed rule is a step in the right direction, but it can do more. NOAA needs to consult with key agencies to better identify the use of forced labor in fisheries. The rule should also include all fishing activities that violate conservation and management measures. The U.S. should be able to identify countries for IUU fishing no matter where in the world it occurs, whether that's in another country's waters or on the high seas. The second measure the U.S. can take to combat these issues is the expansion and enforcement of the Seafood Import Monitoring Program, or SIMP. SIMP requires catch documentation for some species and traceability from the boat to the U.S. border. The reporting requirements for SIMP include what species of fish are being imported and the information on where, when, and how it was caught, and who did the catching. Right now, SIMP only covers 13 species groups, less than 45% of imported seafood. In December of 2022, NOAA issued a proposed rule to expand and improve SIMP, and this has the potential to improve traceability of our seafood through the global supply chains and protect American consumers and fishers, but only if it's expanded to further include all seafood imports. The proposed additional species currently being considered in the rule include additional tuna and snapper species, cuttlefish, squid, octopuses, eels, queen conch, and Caribbean spiny lobster. However, this is less than a 4 to 8% increase in the amount of seafood imports coming into the U.S. by volume, meaning nearly 50% of seafood would still not be covered by these safeguards. Requiring all seafood imports be the subject of robust catch documentation and traceability from boat to plate would provide consumers with more confidence in the seafood that they're consuming. And it's time for NOAA to act and commit to a transparent timeline to expand to all seafood imports. Next, I'll pass on to Nora for her recommendation.
Thanks, Max. There are a couple of things that I think would be really beneficial to prevent forced labor from U.S. seafood supply chains. The first is relating to SIMP. I think the first point is including beneficial ownership in the SIMP reporting requirements. SIMP shares information with Customs and Border Patrol to facilitate enforcement of the Tariff Act. And for those who aren't familiar with it, the Tariff Act makes it illegal for goods made in whole or in part using forced labor from entering U.S. markets. And so Customs and Border Patrol may issue withhold and release orders and enforcement action to prevent imports from entering U.S. markets when they do find that those goods being imported may have been made using forced labor. So through this collaboration between the two agencies, Customs and Border Patrol has been able to issue enforcement orders against vessels seeking to import seafood caught using forced labor. However, Customs and Border Patrol officials have noted that if forced labor is taking place on one vessel, it's likely taking place on that entire fleet of vessels that vessel is a part of. And knowing who the beneficial owner of a particular vessel is would allow them to trace abuses back to the owner of the fleet of vessels, resulting in enforcement action against entire fleets of vessels, as opposed to individual vessels, which is frequently the case now. There's only been one situation in which a fleet of vessels has received enforcement action from Customs and Border Patrol for violation of the Tariff Act. So including beneficial ownership information and sharing that with Customs and Border Patrol would really facilitate stronger enforcement. Secondly, and more broadly, legislation making human rights due diligence mandatory for corporations will result in significant advancement in preventing forced labor and other human rights abuses from U.S. supply chains, including in the supply chains of U.S. fishers as well. French and German due diligence laws are already in force, and we're already seeing cases arising and complaints being filed regarding violations within their supply chains in those countries. And the European Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive is currently moving forward in the European legislative process. If this is signed into law, it'll apply to both European companies and also non-European companies, depending on their size, if they're operating in Europe, which I think is a large portion of larger US companies. So the European due diligence law will have a really significant impact on US supply chains that operate in Europe. That said, human rights due diligence needs to also be made mandatory in the United States as well. US companies should both know and be held accountable for the abuses, including forced labor, that take place throughout their supply chains.
John, your recommendation.
Max. Well, first I'll start by supporting the recommendations from Max and Noor. Absolutely, we need to expand SIM to all seafood imports, and including beneficial ownership would be really important. We've had some success working with Customs and Border Protection on securing withhold release order for a few vessels, based on the evidence that we gathered through interviewing crew or sometimes at sea. But it's very clear that we can't solve this problem one vessel at a time, relying on the meager resources of NGOs to gather the evidence and present it to our government. You know, this effort isn't particularly well resourced, and that needs to change if we're serious about ending forced labor at sea and pirate fishing. Also want to say that for businesses, it has to start with traceability, and we really we have a long way to go. There's been a lot of progress, it's to be fair, but you could walk into almost any supermarket in the United States and buy canned tuna from a major brand and not at all be confident that it wasn't caught with forced labor, and it wasn't caught in ways that put at-risk populations of sharks and sea turtles and others, push them even closer to the brink of extinction. Two of the big challenges on that front are transshipment at sea, that either needs to be outright eliminated from supply chains or much more strongly regulated than it is today, and observer coverage. Some of these fleets that are prone to forced labor in IUU have less than 2% observer coverage. So also want to support the call for human rights due diligence legislation. I think that could go a long way. And in the meantime, we really need businesses to take that much more seriously than they are so far. Thank you.
John, for your recommendations. In January of 2021, Oceana released the results of a nationwide poll, finding that Americans overwhelmingly support policies to end illegal fishing and forced labor. 89% of voters agree that imported seafood should be held to the same standards as U.S. caught seafood. Additionally, 81% of voters say they support policies that prevent seafood from being sold in the U.S. that was caught using human trafficking and slave labor. The findings show widespread bipartisan support for policies aimed at increasing transparency and traceability of seafood. Today, you have the opportunity to make your voice heard. We're facilitating a letter from the attendees of CHOW to the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, to express concern for the issues we have discussed today. I want everyone in attendance to remember that we hold immense power as individuals and as a collective. Our voices can amplify the call for stronger regulations, improved monitoring, and enhanced international cooperation. Together, we can combat IUU fishing, eliminate forced labor, and protect the oceans that sustain the life on our beautiful planet. We will close our session today by hearing recommendations from the people who are the most impacted by these issues. And then we'll put this QR code back up for anyone in attendance today that wants to sign on to this letter. And thank you everyone for showing up and hearing what we have to say.